Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Margot, and I'm the events coordinator at the Hub City Bookshop in Spartanburg, South Carolina. We're so excited to have you join us tonight for a conversation about author Aimie K. Runyan's new novel, The School for German Brides. Yay! Aimie will be joined in conversation by Kate Quinn, whose latest novel is The Diamond Eye. Two really beautiful, really wonderful books. Thank you both, Aimie and Kate, so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Before I hand it over to the authors for the main event, I just want to introduce our bookshop to anyone in the audience who might not be familiar. The Hub City Bookshop is a full-service independent bookstore serving the upstate community in South Carolina. We're part of a larger organization called the Hub City Writers Project, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to cultivate readers and nurture writers. We do that by publishing original titles through our press, as well as by sponsoring a variety of literary programming in the community, including writers' workshops, book clubs, and author conversations just like this. If you'd like to find out anything more about us, our organization, or upcoming events, please head to our website at hubcity.org and sign up for our newsletter. Also, if you have yet to purchase your copy of Aimie's book, please know that you can click the button at the bottom of your screen. There should be a green button that says buy the book and buy a signed copy from us at Hub City. Buying the book through our shop is one of the best ways to support the Writers Project. One last thing before I hand it over and do an intro of our authors. Please feel free to ask questions. Some time will be reserved to answer them. So if you have a question, do not be shy. Submit it using the Ask a Question button or just drop it in the chat at the side of the screen. And we'll keep track of those questions and make sure that Aimie and Kate get to them towards the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I'll introduce our authors. Aimie K. Runyan writes to celebrate history's unsung heroines. She has been honored as a Historical Novel Society Editor's Choice selection, as a 3-time finalist for the Colorado Book Awards, and as a nominee for the Rocky Mountain Fiction Writer of the Year. Aimie is active as an educator and speaker in the writing community and beyond. She lives in Colorado with her amazing husband and 2 usually adorable children. To learn more about her, you can visit her website, www.amiekrunyan.com. Kate Quinn is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of historical fiction. A native of Southern California, she attended Boston University, where she earned a bachelor's and master's degree in classical voice. She has written 4 novels in the Empress of Rome saga and 2 books in the Italian Renaissance before turning to the 20th century with The Alice Network, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, The Huntress, The Rose Code, and the latest, The Diamond Eye. All have been translated into multiple languages. Kate and her husband live in San Diego with their 3 rescue dogs. Kate, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Margot, we just want you to reiterate, you are going to need to keep an eye on the clock and come back in and tell us when it's time to turn over to audience Q&A, because other than that, you are going to be like sending up signal flares from the bookstore trying to tell us it's 3 hours. Everybody went home. So will not, I guarantee you.
Yeah. Shenanigans guaranteed.
Shenanigans guaranteed. Okay, yes. So this is great fun. I'm so glad we were able to do this, and I loved this book. And I think that it's we have so much World War II fiction, and I know we'll talk about that in a bit. But this book felt so different to me and so fresh. And so I thought before we get going, why don't you give us a little bit of an elevator pitch rundown on the plot and the characters, just so that our readers know. We're going to have a no spoiler talk today, in case if you have not read it, but just to give them a little bit of grounding for what they're about to hear us talk about.
So I'll start with the title. The School for German Brides is a direct reference, even though it is kind of allegorical because most of the book doesn't take place in these bride schools. There were bride schools that Hitler and his goons, to use a nice term, created to help train women to be the ideal German housewife. And they were born from the Mutterschule, which were mother schools that were created in the 1920s because there was a very high infant mortality rate And they tried to give these women skills to help raise their children into healthy, or their infants into healthy children, which is, obviously admirable. And they took that concept and took it a step further and basically created a very intensive home economics program with a huge steaming side dish of Nazi propaganda. And so that's like the crux of what the school for German brides is. And there were many of them throughout Germany. Now, the plot itself, we have the main character, Hannah, who is a traditional sort of, not definitely the Aryan ideal, blonde hair, blue eyed, tall, athletic German girl who her mother dies, and she's sent in the first chapter to live with her aunt and uncle to finish up her last year of schooling. She learns very quickly they're very high in the Nazi echelon, and she's expected to partake in the League of German Girls, or the Bund der Deutsche Mädel, and she gets kind of swept up in that whole fervor, and it becomes courted by a man who is very high in the echelon, and that leads her path to this bride school. And the other main character is Matilda, or Tilda Altmann, who is an aspiring lawyer who became a seamstress because women, especially Jewish women, were forbidden from practicing law, practicing medicine, and that's a big plot point for both characters. And so she is forced to work in her mother's dress shop while her mother is basically kind of quasi in hiding because it's becoming more and more dangerous for Jewish people to be out and circulating in society. And Matilda her father was Aryan, and therefore she has a little bit more freedom of movement for a while. And so it is the story of these two women, their voyage into becoming wives, German brides, and how their circumstances being very different, but they intersect. And generally it's a view of the role of German women before and during the earliest days of the war. So big spiel.
Absolutely good. And we promise, as I said, that there was not going to be any spoilers for the ending as we go forward. So you can listen to this, no problem. So School for German Brides, did you come up with that title yourself, first of all? Because I am terrible at titles, and I always end up, just calling a book by some sort of placeholder title and, hoping to God that it doesn't stick.
Yeah, exactly. I called it a Ring of Iron when I was pitching it because the Iron Cross, Ring of Iron, it all kind of fit together. I really liked that title, but they wanted the School for German Brides, the sales team at William Morrow, the Good Fix at William Morrow, really wanted to emphasize the bride school aspect of this book. And I of course, as an author, I worry that the expectations were not going to be met because, a large portion of the book isn't at the bride school. But I'm hoping that people understand the title is metaphorical because really the bride school starts the day that Hannah steps off the platform and enters her aunt and uncle's house. And so that's they came up with it, but I decided, I think it's a captivating title, so it works.
No, it works so well, and it works even metaphorically because the bride school sort of looms like this specter of fate over the whole book.
Yeah, because it's coming.
Where they're going, and it's coming at like for poor Hannah, and like it's coming at her like a train, and it's the question of like, can she dodge the train? And that's really the issue that's at stake for her. Although, of course, not for the other heroine who's has a very different fate coming at her like a train if she does not get out of Germany, and we all know what that one is. So as far as we have the title there, but what was the inspiration for this book?
So when I was working on Across the Winding River, which was my last book, there's a character who's in very similar circumstances to Hannah, who's marrying a much older officer in the SS, and some of their backgrounds don't mesh up, and but I when I was researching Nazi weddings, I'm like, there's got to be some weird Nazi wedding traditions because they had weird traditions for everything, and I stumbled across this article, and yes, they do have weird wedding traditions, They did. But
A lot of paperwork,
they're
I've also heard.
yeah, well, and it's like very neo-pagan, and yeah, it's just there's fire, yeah. And I stumbled across this article from 2014 from the New Yorker about these bride schools, and I'm like, I'm sending Meta, the character from Across the Winding River, to the bride school. I've got to send her there, and she attends the same bride school that Hannah eventually gets thrown into. And I was just like, this is a book. I wanted to write Meta's story, but then I decided to do some other things. So it kind of spiraled into its own story, but centered around the bride schools. But I read that article and I'm like, yeah, that's got to be a book. That has got to be a book. And yeah, it had to be a book.
I actually find that that's quite common, is that you end up finding the inspiration for one book while you're researching another one. And
exactly.
So I don't know. And I think partly it's just that the muse, it gets easily bored. So she'll get bored with whatever it is that you're working on right now and you're trying to research. And she's just like, yeah, I'm bored with that. What about this? This is a really cool idea. Let me date in front of you like catnip and, see if you are going to give me anything new and interesting to work on. And that's when you generally have to wrap her on the wrist to the ruler and tell her to get back to work.
Get back to work on the W. It doesn't matter how fast I draft a book. The affair book always looms large, doesn't it? It's like, oh, I want to start working on this new project. It's like writer ADD. It's like, and that's why, right now I've got like 4 projects going at once, and it actually works well. Because if I'm bored with one project or I'm stuck on a project, I can move to one of the other ones. And that's really nice. I think that really helps. That makes me feel, yeah.
Did you call it an affair book?
Yes, I call it an affair book. The like gleaming affair book. Like, ooh, I should be working on this book, but I want to work on the next one. And it's gleaming and shiny.
Yeah, that's exactly. I'd never used that term for it, but the metaphor I always end up using is like, when you always hit that point with the book that you're writing where it's a real slog, and the equivalent is that like you're in a long-term relationship that's just hit a little bit of a dull patch, or where it feels like your significant other is always on the couch in front of the TV and never talking to you, and you're going to get through it. It'll be fine. You love each other. You're in it for the long haul. But that's exactly the moment when like, I don't know, Alexander Skarsgård shows up at your door with a bottle of champagne and a hotel room key, and you're like, I can't, but right there.
Exactly. It's like I have a book.
What it feels like when the muse dangles a new idea when you're in the trenches with your
exactly.
book.
And I have a shiny new book idea that I've sent off to my editor, and I can't say a word about it yet. It is that new, and I'm dying to hear back about it. But I have a book due in like 4 days. And it's like, I have no business even thinking of spending any mental energy on that book. I have none, but it's so tempting. It's so tempting. The glittery, shiny new idea.
Yeah, beware the new idea. That's always the hard thing. So what was the research like for this particular book? I know readers always want to hear about the research.
Yeah, it was, it was nice because I had written a book kind of that was set in Germany before, Across the Winding River. So I had a little bit already under my belt, and I had some knowledge under my belt. But I pitched this book and sold it during the pandemic, like lockdown. It was spring of 2020 that I sold this book. And so there was I had books from, because one of my main research resources is the CU Boulder Library. I actually have like borrowing privileges from there. I bought like an honorary alumni card, and I can borrow books, and so that's super handy. I had a stack of books on a project I can tell you about later that I had for 2 years because I couldn't even get them back. And so I didn't have access to that, which was strange and hard. So I ended up buying a lot of, like secondhand research books. And I came across, I just had to be creative and find things online. And then, I found this book, a bookshop in Berlin by Francois Frankel. And this was like, I read an entire book to write one chapter. Kate's been there, that. And it's a story of a woman who ran a French language. She's a Jewish woman, a French Jewish woman who is running a bookshop in Berlin. And I have my characters go there to buy illicit copies of Vogue magazine because Clara, who's the bridge character between Hannah and Tilda, is a wannabe fashion designer. And so she loves going to Frau Frankel's shop, Madame Frankel's shop, to buy copies of Vogue magazine. And they were definitely like, I don't think it was banned quite yet, but it was definitely something that a good daughter of a party member wouldn't be seen with. So she had to keep it on the DL. But they like in the scene, they like the goons come in saying, hey, do you have copies of this newspaper? We're going to take them. And that's just the way it was. And, it was, read an entire, 300, 400 page book just to write one chapter. But, that's how it is. But I just loved that chapter. And I found books on what it was like to be Jewish and hiding underground in the Lion's Den in Berlin when they're, clearing out the concentration camps, and how harrowing it was. Because there were people that didn't leave, and there, believe it or not, there were people who survived Jewish people who survived, this mass execution. And it's just, to me, it's mind boggling. And so, yeah, I ended up buying a lot of books, whereas I usually like to check them out and put them back into circulation. But so my research collection got a lot larger.
So, all right, you touched on that a little bit then about the research, but given that this was a pandemic book, how did you get it written? I mean, what was it like writing in lockdown? I mean, because this is something I've talked about with so many friends now, and I felt, at least for me, like it was tough, especially in the beginning, because I felt like I had the attention span of a goldfish and I couldn't focus on anything.
It was so hard. I mean, and first of all, it feels absolutely futile because everything happening on the news is so much more sensational than any nonsense I could write on the page. I mean, I can't make up stuff like happened in 2020. I mean, if I were to write 2020 as a novel, my agent would be like, seriously, that plot line's a bit too much. Let's get rid of the
murder hornets. Really?
Murder hornets? Exactly.
Whatever did happen to the murder hornets? It felt like that was.
I feel like we dropped that plot line. Yeah,
it never followed up on the cut.
Yeah, seriously, and it's like, so it was hard, and I was newly single. Not to get into too much personal stuff, but I had moved out and was living in my own little home with my kids. In September of 19. So I was like, 6 months into living on my own for the first time since I was 22 or something like that. And with my kids, and when their school shut down, I became the homeschooling parent. My ex just, he was working from home and he couldn't be roped in to help. And so I was working on this book in 300 to 500 word chunks from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. because I tried working in the afternoons when we were done with school, and having, like people around in the house, especially a tiny little townhouse. No, that was tough. And I could work when they were asleep, but I really couldn't work when they were awake. And even though I tried, and so it was a slog. It took me a long time to draft this book. Longer. It was like 9 or 10 months just to get the first draft done. And that's usually I try to draft pretty quickly and spend more time editing. And so I managed to get like one round of edits done before I sent it off to our wonderful editor, Tessa. And the fact that she didn't like tear it to shreds and say, Aimie, this was garbage, I was so thrilled. It was a book. I always said it was kind of the book I survived. I was so happy that it felt cohesive at the end. Because I was worried because I changed my mind about certain things halfway through, specifically with Tilda and who her parents were. I decided to make her father not Jewish. Like I made him Aryan, like 10 chapters in. And so I had to go back and make sure everything was consistent. And, I was worried it was a hot mess, but I'm actually really, really happy in retrospect with how it turned out. And I felt like when I went back to do edits after Tessa had read it, that it felt like it was somebody else's work. I was so sleep deprived during the writing of this book. It really did feel like somebody else's work, which I think made the editing process a million times easier, because it's always easier to edit somebody else's work because you see the mistakes. And so I think that was kind of the hidden secret weapon of this book, was that I was so tired when I wrote it, it made editing it a breeze. So
yeah, that is a silver lining.
yeah, I mean, if there was one, yeah.
Yeah, I felt like the trouble with writing in lockdown was so much of it was that for us as writers, especially when we already have the privilege of being able to work from home, you already felt like you were so much luckier than so many of your friends and so many of the other people you knew, who were struggling to adjust to working from home out of like when they've been going to an office, and then we're also, struggling to deal with kids being home as well. And I know that was at least on your plate too. It was not on mine. So I also had the feeling it with being a writer during the pandemic of guilt in some ways. It's like, I didn't feel like I had the right to complain about anything in my job because I had it so much better than anybody else. But on the other hand, sometimes you still kind of got to think, okay, a lot of people do have it worse than I do, but it doesn't mean that sometimes it doesn't still really, really suck. And it doesn't mean that it's not
exactly. Exactly. And, I think that a lot of writers tend to be on the more introverted side, or at least get very comfortable with their own company. I'm one of those people, but I mean, even not being able to go to a coffee shop to write and be surrounded by people and feeling isolated, that was really hard. And yeah, I mean, our careers lend itself to that, but I feel like one of the tricks in my arsenal was moving to a different location if I were stuck. Pardon me. And I'm getting over a cold. This has been a whole thing. And I wrote a lot of, for example, Girls on the Line. I wrote a lot of that in a study room at the library, at the local library. And other books, I just move Daughters of the Night Sky, I wrote in the gym lobby because that was in 2-hour stints while my daughter was in childcare. I got a gym membership for the childcare for 2 hours because it was the cheapest way to get my child away from me for 2 hours while her brother was in preschool. So that's how I wrote that book.
That is innovative. I have to.
Yeah, I mean, so I have to say, I'm used to writing under less than ideal circumstances for sure. But I think it was really hard not having the option and feeling so isolated because, and I know our family, there were people that, from the get-go, like, oh, we're not going to mask. We're not going to do this, that, or the other thing. The minute that it wasn't absolutely like mandated, they stopped. I mean, we're still masking. I rarely go. I'm still doing curbside groceries. I've eaten at a restaurant once in 2.5 years. It's, we're taking it, really, really seriously. And so, it has been very isolating still. And I think that is really hard for the muse. I think it really is. And so doing things like this, like doing virtual events and collaborating, I'm working on a collaborative novel with 2 friends. That was a huge lifesaver. And I think that, it forced me as an artist to find ways to get some sort of socialization because I feel like, it's hard to write about the human condition if you're not part of the human race or feel so isolated from it,
Yeah, that is absolutely something I remember feeling as well. So with this book, I definitely wanted to make sure that, one of the things, there's such a huge preponderance of World War II novels, and yet this is a book that specifically talks about the German civilian side of things, what it's like for German women who are in Berlin and, on the ground. And how did you approach that territory with the idea of you do want to tell this part of the war that is a little less covered by popular fiction, and which is, fascinating, but at the same time, you don't want to be an apologist, at the same time you don't want to at all come across as an apologist for, the average German civilian and what, they might be still responsible for in terms of what they did or did not do to help those who were in their midst who needed it. And just for anybody who might be thinking that is not what this book is. This is not a German apologist book. Just so you know.
No, I mean, really, so how did I treat this German civilian question? Very, very carefully. Because the truth of the matter is, we've had, let's take our 2 most recent leaders here in the United States, both of whom are, you got half the country that despise either side. And, plenty of people who didn't like Trump, plenty of people who don't like Biden. And people who think that they are kind of that they make claims, valid or otherwise, that they are trying to take powers unjustly. So so that's like kind of a view that a lot of people have on the extreme fringes. And if, for example, if one of those leaders had, invaded another country or done sort of the things that Hitler did, thankfully neither has, then, there would be plenty of the population that would be that would have been horrified at what was going on and not having a lot of agency to do much about it. And so I tried to take that into perspective, because then we're taking this to another 10, we're taking this to a much further degree, because I mean, you can't compare either of our democratically elected recent presidents to this demagogue that got rid of all opposing political parties, et cetera, and so forth. Because I mean, it was a totalitarian regime. So I try to keep things, I try to use the present mindset to ground myself in history, because that's a tool at my arsenal. So the truth of the matter is that, obviously a lot of the German civilians didn't have a lot of agency, but that doesn't mean they weren't complicit. And so this book really is exploring the shades of gray as far as culpability and complicity in the larger regime. And you start off, Hannah is 17. She's a kid, and she's sent to live with her Nazi uncle and aunt. And you see, and so in the early chapter, I'd say, she's an innocent, she's a kid. She can't be held, largely responsible at that time. But then as she ages throughout the course of the book and becomes more and more aware of what's going on and becomes more enmeshed in the Nazi echelon, she becomes more and more complicit. And whereas I think she is a likable character because she's a decent human being, and tries to be a decent human being, though she falters at times, she is the product of a society that forced her in some ways to become complicit. But, she has to find a way at the end of the day to take some agency for her own choices. And I think she ultimately does try. Whether or not she's fully successful, that's up to the reader, I think, honestly. But, I definitely tried to make her understandable. I tried to make, because ultimately, especially in the late 1930s and early 1940s, a young woman of her age was raised to be agreeable. And she just lost her mother, which is, I'm not spoiling, that's like a linchpin. The inciting incident is that her mother dies in the first page. And she's sent to live with this aunt and uncle. And even though she doesn't necessarily like them, she wants to please them, because that's what women were raised to do. And she wants to be a good niece. She wants to fit in. She wants to be liked. And she feels very alone. And so that is kind of the motivation behind some of her poor choices. And all the same, I tried to give both characters the agency to make right and wrong decisions. And I hope I was effective in that. But, I'd say overall, it is a book about exploring the shades of gray as far as culpability and complicity in the Nazi regime.
Yeah. And the thing I remember too about, Hannah's situation was that it's not even just that she wants to be liked. It's that she's had a rejection at the same time as she's had a loss. Her father, her mother, she loses her mother to death. And then her father basically says, I can't deal with a teenage daughter, and sends her off to live with relatives. So that's a rejection. And it's sending her the message at a very vulnerable age that you're too much trouble to deal with. And if you go, and then, so therefore she walks into this house on day one thinking, at least subliminally, if I'm too much trouble here, where am I going to go next? Is there even next? So it's not even just the fact that she's young and she wants to be liked. There's the specter of real homelessness or real being without a family at all, because her father, she lost her mother, but her father also rejected her. And we can, and that actually wasn't very uncommon in those days, that dads would, if they were widowed, it wasn't that uncommon for the father to just send the kids to live with family, at least for maybe a couple of years, if they were at
before they remarried. Yeah,
before they grieved. Maybe while the dad went and got another wife, or because I was just reading about this in some research of my own, where it's like a girl kept getting sent away to relatives, like when her father died, and then he'd bring them back for a year, and then things wouldn't go well, so he'd send them away again. And it like she wasn't allowed to come back and live with her father again until he got another wife. And it was
exactly.
like, that was more common back then. So I'm not saying that her father in this book is a monster. It's a relatively common thing, but it's what we think of nowadays. So it's like this idea that this girl, she's not even just, well, I want to be liked and I want to please people. It's also like, if I don't please people, I don't have anywhere else to go.
Exactly. And so she doesn't, especially in the early chapters, does not have a lot of agency over her own life. And how many 17-year-old children, and I use that term deliberately, do? And so that was kind of how I bought some sympathy for Hannah, to make her understandable and relatable, because we've all been 17-year-old kids at one point or another. I'm assuming most everybody who reads this is 17 or up. Not saying it's necessarily inappropriate for like a 15 or 16-year-old, but parents.
And I would say if I was like 15 or 16, I would have loved this book. I mean, so if you think if a teenager should read it, yes, they can. It'll be fine for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's and there's a few tough scenes that you should talk with your teenagers about if they do read it. But the reality was that, yes, this was a culturally normal thing for a father. A father is not going to be expected to solo parent. That's just not the way it is, unless you were wealthy and had staff.
Yeah.
If you were wealthy and had staff or had a sister that came to live, he would take time to grieve and then find another wife. And so he sent there, because unusual for a lot of my character actually has brothers. Actually, she's not an only child. And he sent the brothers off to boarding school and sent her for her last year to live with his brother and sister-in-law. And, that was a decision I made very, very early on, because I just imagined her being in such a vulnerable place that would make her all the more susceptible to being swept up in the fervor of the Nazi cause, because it was enticing. It was seductive. The Nazis with their sleek uniforms, and they fed people, and you can imagine, I can understand why a naive, impressionable kid, it would fall into this group. And the only youth group, this is an important thing, the only youth group that was legal by this time in Germany was the Hitler Youth for boys, the Hitler Jugend for boys, and the Bundesdeutsche Mädel for women, or the League of German Girls. And so, I mean, you couldn't join a soccer league. You couldn't go to you probably have like a private knitting group or something, but I mean, no large organized group for kids was allowed. And this was a way to feel like part of something bigger. And kids crave that. Absolutely.
So we talked quite a bit about Hannah, but that's one of your heroines. How about what was it like writing your Jewish heroine and her particular very different situation? Because for Hannah's story, the arc is very much one about exploring shades of culpability. Where is it that you take responsibility and agency, and in her and in later consideration, where is it that you take your part of guilt? So where is it? How about your other heroine and what her particular arc was like?
Okay, so it was interesting because I started
her, and I want to talk about them, but it will be a spoiler for the audience. So I wish I could.
Yes, I really enjoyed it, and what's funny is that I pitched this book with just Hannah, and our editor, I say art because Kate and I have the same editor. She was worried about it becoming a German apologist book, and I don't consider Hannah to be like the German savior, innocent character at all. But of course, from the synopsis and 3 chapters, you can't tell that. So she suggested that that one of the suggestions she made was having a second POV character who was Jewish. And because our editor was Jewish, I was like very, very nervous and very, very intent on getting it right. And we had an outside sensitivity reader on top of everything, because I wanted to make sure that I treated Tilda with sensitivity and accuracy. Accuracy being the most important thing, because I wanted to, reflect the historical realities of what it was like to be a half Jewish, half Aryan girl. And I use that term deliberately as well, in the late 1930s in Berlin.
Yeah, unfortunately,
And
the term they used was Mischling, which was actually
Mischling,
meant mongrel,
half-breed.
which was just absolutely terrible. But that is the
Yeah,
terminology
half-breed.
that was used for what it was considered was.
And no, the German hierarchy being so specific, like they had first degree Michelin, second degree Michelin, and and it's like there were rules about who could marry whom, and it was a whole thing. And she was fascinating. I was so worried because to put this POV character in at the suggestion of an outside person, it wasn't organic to me. I'm like, oh, am I going to be able to do this? But I started writing her just to see if I could, and she came pretty easily. And so I was happy about that. And I love the idea of, because Hannah's mother had been a doctor and wasn't able to practice medicine because of the decree that came down in either 1933 or 36. I can't remember which part. My apologies. It's been a while since I wrote the book. Where women could not practice law and Jewish people could not practice law, and Jewish people and women could not practice medicine other than midwifery. And I don't think even Jewish women might have been able to deliver babies for other Jewish women, but it was a whole thing. And the important thing to know is that there were more women lawyers and doctors in Germany than any other country in the Western world at this point. So it shaped the whole country. It was a big thing. And so you have that on both sides of the narrative. And you have Tilda, who's brilliant. She's the smartest character in the whole book. And she wanted to be a lawyer. Her grandfather had been a lawyer. Her mother's father had been a lawyer. And her father was a lawyer and worked at the same firm. But then when the law came down that Jews could not practice law, her grandfather lost his position as partner in his own law firm. And her father took it over. And that becomes a whole thing. And just her anger at being relegated. And she's a talented seamstress. She teaches Clara, who's our bridge character between the two narratives, she teaches her how to sew beautifully. And she's great at what she does. She has an eye for fashion, but she's relegated to something she doesn't care that much about. I mean, it would, most of I know a lot of authors, for example, who are fashionistas, and they look beautiful, and they know a lot about fashion, but it's a side interest, and that's what it would be for Tilda. She was always the sharpest dressed kid around. She enjoyed, messing around, making her own clothes, but it wasn't something she wanted to do for a vocation. And I liked playing with the idea of her, being forced to live in a sphere that was so much smaller than what she deserved. And her being her mother's link to the outside world, trying to get visas so they could leave. And so I portrayed that whole arc. If Hannah's arc is all about delineating the shades of gray of culpability, for her, it's regaining agency over her own life. And I wanted to avoid the trope of the Jewish people in Germany and other places that were invaded by Germany being led to the execution like lambs to the slaughter, because boy howdy, that was not the case. You had so many of them that were trying everything in their power to find a way out and being denied left, right, and sideways, but they tried. And you also had people who were steadfastly holding onto their homes because they'd been there for generations. They were not just Jewish, they were German or French or Dutch, whatever, and they didn't want to leave their homes, and just the way any of us wouldn't want to. And so for many of them, even though they didn't want to leave, by the time they realized what danger they were in, it was too late. And and that kind of horrific realization. But they because they didn't take away their powers over their rights overnight. It was being crushed one pebble at a time is the metaphor I use in the book. And, it was her trying to regain, to dig her way out from that pile of pebbles and regain some agency over her own life.
Yeah. From a country that is determined to take it all away.
Yes.
Yeah. So can I tell you something fun about this book? And I know we're going to take questions probably pretty soon. So be free to, I think there's a place to submit your questions or at least get them ready. But can I tell you something fun where I think in my own mind, there's a little bit of a crossover between this book and The Diamond Eye?
Yes, go for it.
Yes, and I'm doing this without spoilers, which is a little difficult, but let's just say that there is a really horrible SS officer in this book at some point who he is listed as finally as he meets his end on the Russian front. And in my mind, because when I wrote The Diamond Eye, which is all about the Soviet woman sniper, she literally was a researcher and aspiring historian who ended up becoming the most successful female sniper in World War II on the Eastern Front, where SS officers went to die. And in my mind, as soon as I read that in your book, I was like, Mila got him. She absolutely got him.
It's canon now. It's
canon. She nailed. Her official tally was 309 of 309 Nazi invaders to her country on the Eastern Front, the Russian front, as they would have called it. And in my mind, that guy, and we both know who I'm talking about, the readers will too, that guy is one of her 309. She got him.
Like 187. So. Yeah, he's like 187. There we go.
So there we go. My mind, there's a crossover. So I had fun with that.
I love that. And before we let things go to questions, we should tell everybody how you and I actually got to know each other better.
Oh God, yes, that's fun.
Okay, so I had written, and here, this is my collection of books. This is my body of work right here, and I wrote 2 books that were Canadian colonials that kind of fizzled a little bit because there's not, believe it or not, a huge readership for Canadian colonial literature, even though they have found the readership since, which is great. But I had to switch gears, and I think Kate had to go through this too in her career. And I said, you know what? I sat down with my then agent and I said, here's a list of like 8 ideas for my idea file. What should I work on next, agent dear? She said, Russian female fighter pilots. Do it, Runyan. And I said, okay. And so I'm halfway through working on a manuscript that would become Daughters of the Night Sky. It was going to be my big break. It was going to be, my way to maintain a writing career. And Kate Quinn, the great Kate Quinn, and we saw the Alice Network was going to do big things by that. This is right before the Alice Network. She writes, I stayed up way too late last night researching the Soviet female fighter pilots. And there's a cloud of profanity hanging over Frederick, Colorado, still wafting up. I see this at 6 in the morning before I'm getting my children ready for school. I'm like, oh, bleep, bleep, totally bleep. This is not happening. This is not happening. So in a moment of complete and utter lack of professionalism, I text Kate, don't do it. Don't do it. I'm halfway through this manuscript. I have to write this book. And she says, all right, dude, slow your roll. It's going to be fine. It's one timeline. It's not like an entire book about the night witches. And I'm like, okay, fine. And so we talk and we make sure that we're not naming our characters the same thing. And we exchange some research ideas and things like that. But on that same post, a mutual friend of ours, Libby Hawker / Libby Grant, says, hey, my editor at Lake Union asked me to write a book about the night witches. If you're looking for a house for your book, Kate, you should come to Lake Union. And you said, well, I'm fine, but my friend Aimie is writing a book about the night witches. So I text my agent at 5 p.m. on a Friday, and I said, hey, we got to pitch this book like tomorrow to Lake Union. And she's like, okay, again, slow your roll. Aimie, slow your roll, because just because one editor at one time said that they were interested in this book, I'm like, no, she's asking her people to write it right now. We've got to pitch it. She's like, fine, we'll pitch it. We had a deal. We had an offer 4 weeks later on half a manuscript that became Daughters of the Night Sky. So, and then Kate and I, yeah.
That is literally how it happened. And it was like, I still remember, it was like, it's a little bit of a weird thing when you realize you're writing something completely by accident that is very similar to a friend is writing. So there's like a few slightly wary, like, are you doing like this? I'm doing it like this. And then the thing that we really liked was that we really did have 2 completely different approaches. Hers has a book that really talks about the night witches in detail. That's the whole book. Mine, it was 1/3 of a plot line and not even like 1/3 of the book, because that character goes to other things past the night witches. So I have quite a lot about it, but it's not the whole book. So
yes,
we really enjoyed that. And the fun part is that we can now recommend each other's books, like to book clubs and things. So when people say, I would love to read more about the Night Witches, I'm just like, well, let me recommend you Amy's book, Daughters of the Night Sky, which I read and loved. And I did, and we read each other's stuff. But it also meant too that like we were very careful, because inspiration can be a very permeable thing. So
it is. It's hard.
It is like stuff leaks into your work, and then you end up thinking, which is why I can be sometimes a little bit sympathetic to not all by any means, but sometimes plagiarism stuff. I end up thinking, I can see why people end up with something that's similar on occasion, just because you maybe read something similar and you did something similar with it. But does that mean it's plagiarism? And there's inspiration is really weird and it's very permeable. So I ended up saying to Amy, it's like, I'd love to cover quote this book, but I'm not like, she was done before I was. And I was just like, I'm still drafting. I don't dare read anything of yours about the Night Witches, because I don't want to end up like subconsciously borrowing some literary choice.
Yeah, exactly. And I got to read The Huntress, which was Kate's Night Witches book. While it was still in draft form. It was like before you even cut 60,000 words out of it, and it read like a novella. It was like, it was so fast paced and wonderful. I loved it. But
so we had fun though too, because we geeked out about the research together, because once you get past the like, okay, it's weird that we're both writing about the same thing. It was about the fun stuff like, oh my God, are you using this particular anecdote? Because it's amazing and I don't have room for it in mine. Are you going to use it? Please tell me you can.
Yeah.
You had stuff like
exactly.
That, like, because we're
like
also
having to fly drunk.
Yeah,
they had to fly drunk once. And what was the other thing? Like the
one that you used that I didn't was like when they were making underwear out of parachute silk, because they were
the silk,
the real Night Witches,
they got in serious trouble.
They got in trouble for that, but it's like the real Night Witches had to like wear these huge, like Soviet mass-produced men's briefs, Red Army produced men's briefs for men, and it's like they hated it. And it's like I can understand making a pair of panties out of parachute silk.
Yeah, because they didn't like using the parachutes on the flares that they used to mark their targets, because it actually impeded the accuracy of the flares. So they just repurposed the silk to make underwear. My mother still cringes at the scene where they get their men's briefs, and one of them looks at the flap in the front and said, well, we got a place to put our lipstick, ladies. And my mother just cringes at that line every time. And yeah, it's funny. And, it's, that book, I'm a little bit more daring in Daughters of the Night Sky, given that, Russia was just a different place. I mean, there wasn't kind of the rigidity like in Germany. And the expectations for sexual purity and that sort of thing. So I had fun with that. And it's kind of a good test. Like if you can handle Daughters of the Night Sky, you can kind of handle me as a human being, because it is getting into some of my snarkier side of my personality. So,
yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. And it was like, I had a lot of fun with that as well. It was my first toe that I dipped into the, sort of the water for a Soviet set book during World War II. And then that eventually was, because I got an idea at the same time I was researching the Night Witches, and that's where I got the idea for the Diamond Eye. So that's, again, full circle how these things tend to happen.
Yes.
So I know we can take some questions now if anyone wants to throw them in, but while we're waiting on that, I think definitely people are going to want to know, what do you have coming next? And I think
okay, so I have you guys, this just became public today. I'm going to see if I can make it visible. The Castle Keepers. This is the project that kept me sane during lockdown. I collaborated with my dear friends, Rachel McMillan and Janelle Soselsky. And it is a book that takes place over 3 generations in the same castle. 3 generations of the same family touched by war. My part takes place in the 1870s with somebody who's returning from the war in India that happened 5 years prior. And then we have Janelle's that takes place after or during World War I, and Rachel's takes place right after World War II. And it's 3 generations dealing with love and loss after being touched by war, and their relationship with the ancestral home, this castle, Leechwick Castle, which is totally made up, but it's based on Alnwick Castle, which is where Harry Potter was filmed. And it was amazing fun, and just being able to collaborate with two amazingly talented authors was a great deal of fun, and it was a great way to socialize during the lockdown. And then my next solo book is called A Bakery in Paris, being published by the same great people at William Morrow who published The School for German Brides, and it's a dual narrative that is split between 1870, which is apparently a timeline I like a lot, and with the Paris Commune and the siege of Paris, the Prussian siege of Paris, so 1870, 1871, and post World War II, so 1946, and two women from the same family in the same bakery, trying to make their way in the world. And so it's basically Les Mis meets Chocolat. And that book was an absolute joy to write. And I'm also working on a contemporary women's fiction, probably coming out next October-ish, called The Memory of Lavender and Sage. And that just got titled. So busy. Lots of typing.
Oh, and just the fun thing, Aimie and I are what we call full agency, full author sisters, which means that we share both the same editor and at the same publication house, and also the same literary agent. So that's, if you ever wonder why why writers sometimes do this is my agency sister, or this is my editorial sister, that's where it comes from. And sometimes you get some that are actually both. So we are like full sisters author-wise.
We're full siblings. It's great. It's so great.
Yeah, you can imagine the Thanksgivings. It's great.
Yes, it's wonderful.
All right. Do we have any questions? Or I can keep chatting if the audience is quiet.
Looks like the audience is being a little bit shy, but I have a question that I think is representative of sort of what our audience would sometimes ask, which is both of you are very experienced writers with a lot of books under your belt, been in the world for a long time. What is the most unexpected thing that that you've encountered in your career as writers, for both of you?
On the serious side, just never feeling like, it's just always feeling that kind of feeling of imposter syndrome, that this is going to be the book that tanks me, this is going to be terrible, and always the relief when you're proven wrong, but never feeling like the ground is truly under your feet. Is the thing that I figured, by the time, once I get an agent, I feel I'll have made it. Once I get a good book deal, I'll have made it. No, it doesn't really feel that way. It's like, contract to contract. And, but you learn to cope with it.
Yeah. I think it's the idea that the realization that the business is a roller coaster. You think at the beginning it's a smooth line up.
It's trajectory.
It's a trajectory upward. It's like, you get the agent, then you get the book deal. Next book deal will automatically be a bigger book deal, all the way up, nicely progressing. And the thing is that you never know when a book is going to tank. And it might be this one, it might be the next one, but everybody knows, like, at some point, something you have is probably not going to work. And
and not every book is better than the last one. It's just the reality of it.
Yeah. So sometimes, you realize it's like you had a book idea that felt great, but it tanked. And, or, you had a book that you didn't think was going to do very well, but suddenly that's the one that took off. It's like you have no way of knowing. And you have to get used to the idea that, just because you're on the downside today doesn't mean you won't be on the upside tomorrow. And just because you are flying high today does not mean you won't be taking a header into the concrete tomorrow. It's all up and down. And so that's why you just have to look at it as, I'm in it for the long haul, and I'd like to, make it balance out for the long run. But you have to sort of take the take the ups and downs, because there are going to be.
As our agent Kevin would say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But on the less serious side, the thing I didn't expect was so many trips to the post office. Oh my gosh. Like, I did not expect that. Like, mailing off ARCs and all that sort of thing. I did not expect that, but it's fun. I love sending out swag and all that sort of thing. It's fun.
You need to get a postage. I'll tell you what Laura Kamoy told me, and she's a goddess, so I always pass this on. Get a postage scale and like a printer at home, so you can print off your own labels and weigh your own packages, and it will save you a lot of trips to the post office.
I did that this last time. What is it called? Pirate Ship. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. So
Yeah, I would say on the good side, what I love about this business is the tribe that you find, because we are a very isolated. It is an isolated job. You are behind your computer. You're not doing a lot, but you're not meeting people a lot unless you're going to a conference, that kind of thing. But there is a tremendously supportive group of community out there if you can find it, which is why I always tell young writers, you need to find your tribe. You need to find the people who are somewhere around the same stage of the journey as you, who will be your friends, who will encourage you, and who you have that Google chat open on your phone all the time, so that therefore, like when you have something like, that really insensitive Twitter bot who tagged you in a bad review on Twitter to try to get a response out of you, you don't respond on Twitter. You go to your private Google chat with your 5 closest author friends. Can you believe this guy? Copy paste, and you all spend the next 5. I'll spend the next, hour, dissecting this person's grammar and their probable personal hygiene, and you feel much better by the end of it, and you don't post on social media. This is why
exactly. Never post on social media. When in doubt, don't post. But yeah, that was something I expected, because I started writing seriously in about 2013 and went to my first conference in 2013. And I expected it to be cutthroat and vicious and terrible. And the number of people there was one snarky woman that saw a first-time attendee, and I was also a finalist in the contest for Daughter or Promise to the Crown for the first chapter. And she's like, "Oh, pardon me while I knock you off your chair." But aside from that snarky woman, who I've never seen again, everybody, like the amount that people are willing to help and to be supportive and to mentor other people was amazing to me, because I thought it was going to be cutthroat and vicious. And I found that people who act that way and who are not supportive are not the ones who end up succeeding.
No, they really aren't. The people who are, and generous, I do want to say generous, but there is also the fact that part of the generosity is when you learn to be generous to yourself. And sometimes your closest friends are the ones who say, you need to stop giving all the time. You need to start cutting out. You need to start being able to say no and setting those boundaries so you have time to get your own writing done. And that's another place where, having friends will help you, set those boundaries too. But you will find your tribe, and those will be the people who will always have your back, and the people who will bring you down to earth, or who sometimes they'll give you the reality check. Like, you have some great idea, and that your friend is the one who says, no, you cannot write that story. That is really not your story to write. You will be sorry if you write that. Or, it's like, this is not a story that will sell in this climate, or it will be way too controversial, or, it's just not a story that it's the historical era is not popular right now. You write this, you are wasting 3 years on a book that probably won't sell yet.
Sometimes Aimie, stop writing the book about Aimie, stop writing the book about the 15th century Irish pirates. Okay, stop it. It
doesn't mean you can't ever write about 15th century Irish pirates. You will, I'm sure. It's just that right now, maybe the Paris Bakery is a better idea.
Yeah, and it was. It totally was.
So that's the fun part about what we have found about our particular job.
Those were really enlightening, really wonderful answers, really in-depth answers. Thank you so much for that. We are at the end of it. Went so fast. We're at the end of our hour. I can't believe it.
I had no doubt.
We've run out of time. I want to thank you both so much for being here. It was an honor to have you. Again, everyone in the audience, please click the link or come into the shop if you're local. Buy this beautiful book. We also have copies of Kate's books and Amy's books. Yeah,
I don't have the diamond eye handy. I probably, if you look back there, I've got some of Kate's other.
I don't have it either because I'm on a research trip, or else I'd hold up a copy.
Oh, you froze.
Yeah.
So. I think our internet is acting a little wonky here at Hub City Writers Projects. Oh, you're back. You're moving a little bit better. I will. It must be our internet here because it's both of you. So I'm so sorry about those last minute technical difficulties, but thank you both for being here. And for the audience, I just want to remind everybody that you will be able to watch the recording of this here at this link and also at our Hub City YouTube page. Aimie and Kate, I'm so sorry you're both gone. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and have a great night.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.